And thank you very much for coming along again to Eco Views and News. This evening we want to look at something that's happened over the summer and in fact is coming up in the fall. And it's a very important issue for anyone interested in the environment and food issues. Consumption of our daily food items, questions of farm policy and things like that. We're really up against a very interesting array of things that are going to show up on the ballot, not in this part of the country, but in fact out in California. And you may say, well, who cares? I mean, that's out in California, we're here on the East Coast, and this is Boston, and we're Cambridge, and after all, they have their problems, we have our problems. But one of the things I want to focus on is the way in which, in effect, our whole national food system is implicated in what's coming up in California. So what we're going to look at today is this whole question of the high cost of cheap food. We've had a cheap food policy in the United States ever since World War II, at least, and it's been based on what now is called conventional agriculture. Conventional, you'll often see this if you go to the food stores, even an organic food store or a store that has organic materials, they'll differentiate between conventional bananas and organic bananas, or conventional vegetables and organic vegetables. Well, the idea of what's conventional is very interesting. It's only become a convention since World War II. Prior to that, petro-intensive agriculture was not very widely practiced. But since World War II and the introduction on a large scale of tractors into every aspect of production, and then the processing industry, everything taking things from the farm to the fork, all of that has created a petro-intensive form of agriculture. And what we need to do is a kind of full cost accounting of this to really come up with an assessment of what's going into the cheap food policy. So rather than calling it conventional, it's perhaps best to call it a petro-dependent agriculture. Now we want to look at the full cost accounting of a petro-dependent agriculture and why it is that in California these issues seem to become an important public issue that may well affect our welfare here in the East Coast and in fact throughout the world, as we'll see. And a lot of this has been drawn to our attention by a book called The Omnivores Dilemma, written not too long ago, and you can get access to various summaries of it like this, or discussions of it on YouTube. Take a look. It's interesting, actually, to see who weighs in on these issues.
Almost everyone's heard of Omnivores Dilemma.
I look at Omnivores as like the Bible for chefs.
It's the most important book on food politics of the last 50 years. When I first read Omnivores Dilemma, it was this very buzzy book. People were writing about it in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, so it was kind of impossible to avoid this book.
What it really did for me, and probably a lot of other chefs, really just opened our eyes to what was happening, what was really out there.
I was concerned because as a major league eater, we take a lot of flack. But I enjoyed it much more than I thought I would.
There's so much information about food. I'll be honest, this book kind of stresses me out.
We have a vested interest in making sure that more people read Omnivores.
Well, the genesis of Omnivores Dilemma goes back to some reporting I was doing for the New York Times Magazine. You have to remember I was an Easterner and had not really experienced the scale of modern industrial farming. And that
Now that's crucial to understand, that Michael Pollan was an Easterner, hadn't really understood the scale of modern industrial farming, hadn't been out there to see what was happening. And he wrote this, in a sense, more focused on the consumer, on a restaurateur perspective, on what are we eating. But he then looked into the agricultural food chain and to see all of those issues that are treated in the general category of from farm to fork. And that's, in fact, where he started to realize there's something fundamental wrong with the American food system. And not just the American, it's not necessary to nationalize this. There's something wrong with the petro-intensive food system. that looks upon food commodities to be produced by petroleum machinery in much the way that factory commodities are produced for sale on the international market. Take a look. It's really quite interesting.
That's when it occurred to me that Americans didn't know where their food came from. And it would be interesting to do a kind of detective story following the food back to the source.
Basically, the book describes the state of food in America by exploring 3 different food chains:
Corn.
Grass.
and the forest.
The first section of the book, which I'd imagine was the eye-opener for most people, is about investigating the industrial cost of making everything out of corn.
When you walk
Okay, investigating the industrial cost of making everything out of corn. Basically, Pollen takes a look at the shelf, sees what corn components are represented in every piece of packaged food, and concludes, as several others have before him, this isn't terribly original or brand new breaking research. He's a journalist, right? He's a journalist. He's summarizing other people's research. But to bring to the attention of the American people how much of what they're eating is corn is quite an achievement.
walk into a grocery store, when you walk into any of those aisles, all you are seeing everywhere, whether or not you know it, is corn.
It was surprising and eye-opening how far we've come and how far we removed ourselves from this idyllic idea of a farm. And this sort of brought it right home, front and center.
In the second part of the book, Michael Pollan takes us to this small family farm called Polyface.
No fertilizers are used. Everything works through the relationships that nature has designed.
Basically, it all boils down to poop, because the chicken poop is fertilizing and the chickens are eating something out of the cow's poop that they get their nutrients from.
3 ecological resources: the grass, the sun, the photosynthesis, the cow that turns this grass into delicious fat and meat for us. That's the true definition of sustainability.
The third section is about hunting and gathering.
We learn what it's like to hunt for your food and eat it, and all of the ethical problems that come along with that.
I really don't think I could do it. I don't think I could pull a trigger and kill a deer.
I've never shot a gun, but if you tell me that there's a pig that's going to be pancetta at the end of it, then let's go out there and shoot this thing.
The biggest impact that Omnivores Dilemma has had is, 1, people are really absolutely considering the types of food that we're eating, and 2, I think people are really taking action. I don't think people used to really talk about raising chickens in their backyard in Brooklyn. I don't think that was realistic 10 years ago.
When you feel smarter about a subject, you don't generally feel engaged to make change. The power of omnivores is that you feel empowered.
When people start really thinking about how animals are being raised, and they say to themselves, I want to continue to eat meat, but I don't want it raised like that.
Okay, well, this is the whole point of that book. The Omnivores Dilemma actually gets people to be conscious of what they're eating. And not a bad idea. I mean, take a look at it. Read the labels, at least. And then look at the whole production system behind it. And look at its petro-intensivity. What kind of decisions have been made about petroleum imports that end up in the food in one way or another, or end up in the packaging, in the processing, in the nutrient load of the food. It's really a very challenging book in this respect to invite us to look at those things again, and particularly in the meat, chicken, and pork sector.
I need the alternative.
The most dangerous thing about the industrial food system is that the food doesn't taste good. To have flavor, you have to have all the minerals and microvitamins that come out of healthy soil. So flavor and nutrition are sort of the same subject.
When you look at some of the things that are going on today, especially with diabetes and heart disease, and obesity is the same problem. Obesity is not from overeating, it's from eating junk. Just through eating better food, we can take care of a lot of this.
Now, that's a very interesting proposition. Just through eating better food, as the logic of this chef, just through eating better food, we can take care of a lot of this, is what he says. Now, a lot of this in his formulation is a lot of the health problems that we're up against and beginning to witness, the rise in diabetes and the like. As he says, okay, just through eating better food, we can take care of a lot of this, the public health issues. Well, this is the kind of full cost accounting we need to do for petro-intensive agriculture. It may lead to cheap food, or even cheaper food, you can ask anybody who goes to a supermarket, it's more expensive to buy the organic alternative than it is to buy the quote-unquote conventional or petro-intensive alternative. But what's being hidden in that cheaper cost at the purchase place in the supermarket? What's being hidden is all the external costs that have been thrown out by the producer, externalized as the economists say, and put as a burden on the rest of society. If people are getting sick from this food, then there's a cost having to do with their medical care. If the environment is being destroyed, if the water system and the groundwater recharge is being destroyed and becoming poisoned with pesticides and the like, then there's a public health problem with a water supply. Now, a chef like this will say, just through eating better food, we can take care of a lot of this stuff. Well, that's a very interesting proposition. Obviously, some questions occur. So why aren't we eating better food? Obvious question. We all should be. In fact, how do you figure out what is better food? This is not altogether easy. We're not all nutritionists. We haven't done PhDs in advanced nutrition content of various kinds of foods, and you can't expect to pick it up on a label, 2x3 label, even if it's that big, in a supermarket. So how do we decide what's better food? How do we tell if it's better or not? In fact, if we could tell it was better or not from the label, you'd have labels that would say, well, this is better for you than that, right? Well, they don't tell you that kind of thing. In fact, the question is what's showing up on the label altogether. We need to pay attention to the labels, that's for sure. We need to read them, but we also need to understand what they're saying. It doesn't just do any good if you're given a whole lot of statistics about what percentage this, that, and the other thing of niacin you're getting in the portion size of a particular product you've just picked up in the supermarket. The question is whether the information displayed on that label is useful information, actionable information. What if, in fact, there are no labels, or not meaningful labels, the labels you can read that don't contain information that you really need? Well, this is why there is a huge problem emerging in California. You'd ask yourself, well, why could this and how could it happen in a free and open society where information just flows off of Google at the press of a command on your computer? You can find out anything about everything instantaneously. Why don't we know what's in our food? It's an obvious question. We'd eat better if we knew more, is the logic. Well, let's take a look at what's been happening in California and follow some of the coverage of why we're not getting the information. On one of the programs recently, Tom Hartman asked the question, if you were eating food that could kill you, would you want to know? Do you want to know about this? He put the question quite dramatically. I think it's worth seeing, in a sense, from the outset. Let's take a look.
If you were eating something completely unnatural, something that could make you sick, could give you cancer, make your testicles shrink, heck, even kill you, wouldn't you want to know? If you answered yes, then you're on the same side as over 90% of your fellow Americans. Poll after poll over the last few years has shown that more than 90% of Americans support specific labeling of genetically modified foods that they buy in grocery stores. And European and other developed countries routinely require labeling of GMOs, genetically modified organisms or foods. But even though for years Americans have been demanding the right to know what's in their food and whether or not it's frankenfood, not a single piece of state or federal legislation has ever been passed to make it happen. Which brings us to California. Efforts to force that state's legislature to pass laws to require labeling of genetically modified foods have failed. So now citizens of that state have taken matters into their own hands. After collecting more than 1 million signatures, the citizens of California put Proposition 37 on the ballot for November, which will force all genetically modified foods to have special labels. Good news, right? Well, now the fight is just starting. That's because the biggest purveyors of genetically modified foods, giant corporations like Monsanto, DuPont, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, all of them are spending enormous amounts of money to defeat Proposition 37. They don't want you to know what's in your food. Monsanto alone has spent more than $4 million. So too has DuPont. And in total, the GMO industry has raised $25 million to kill Prop 37 and to kill your right to know what's in the food you eat.
Well, that's pretty radical. I mean, we should be interested in that kind of move on the part of corporations to keep you from knowing that you might be eating genetically modified crops in the vegetable section or processed food of any kind. And we saw earlier on how much corn accounts for the inputs into the whole range of things in the supermarket. If that's being derived from genetically modified corn, you think you ought to know, and then you can look at the label and say, well, maybe I don't want this. But the whole battle is over whether or not you're going to be allowed to read that on the label, whether that information can be conveyed. And $27 million being devoted to keep you from knowing that in one state, in California, is pretty extraordinary. So a lot of questions remain.
On the other hand, the supporters of Prop 37 have only raised $2 million. This is going to be an uphill battle. But here's why it's so important. And here's why corporations like Monsanto don't want Prop 37 to pass. Despite what we've all been told, despite the assurances that GMOs are not dangerous to humans, evidence to the contrary is startling. A few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Jeffrey Smith, the executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology and author of the book Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of the genetically engineered food you're eating. And here are some of the amazing things he told me that you should know, just as this battle in California picks up.
When a lawsuit was filed against the FDA, they were forced to turn over their secret internal memos, 44,000 of them. And it turns out that the statement of the policy was a lie, that it was actually the overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA that GMOs were dangerous and should be carefully tested. They warned against toxins, allergens, new diseases, and nutritional problems. This is called potentially precancerous cell growth. There's no tumors yet found, but it's proliferative cell growth. For some reason, the cell architecture is completely different in the rats that ate the genetically modified potato. Right. But here's the scary thing. When a pediatrician named Michelle Perro saw these research studies, she said, uh-oh, we've got a problem. This is what we're seeing in our children. She has seen changes in the digestive capacity and the digestive effects in children that are different than they were 30 years ago. Kids that are allergic to everything or have failure to thrive, can't eat anything. And we see that this kind of disruption may be throughout the American population, because inflammatory bowel disease is up 40% since GMOs were introduced, colitis, ulcers, etc. They took the Bt toxin out of Monsanto's corn, applied it to human cells. It poked holes in the cells, causing leakage, the same kind of holes that may kill insects. One of the scientists that I work with gave a talk in Germany and described the behavioral, physiological, and neurological changes in laboratory animals and livestock that were fed genetically modified feed. And an autism specialist came up to him afterwards and said, these are exactly what we're seeing in autistic children.
Whoa. Well, you can see why this is explosive material. If our food supply is being modified, shifting towards the petro-intensive alternative of genetically modified organisms, off which presumably the Monsantos and the big petrochemical firms associated with the food companies can make more money off of. If that's being done, shouldn't we be told about it? Shouldn't we be able to read on the label, this is one of those kinds of food? I wonder they're spending so much money keeping us from learning about that. Well, what are the implications of this beyond just an information question? Well, or just a California question. Suppose you said, well, okay, this is interesting out in California, but they have a tendency to get excited about things. San Francisco held a rally this last May, and in fact a conference from 18th to 19th of May on Justice Begins with Seeds, an international conference focusing on this. We haven't caught up on the East Coast yet, but More recently, a group has suggested that we all get engaged with this battle out in California. Join the GMO Awareness Month. When? Well, in October. It's coming up. And who is this group? Well, as it turns out, it's a group called the Global Justice Ecology Project. This has to do with global justice ecology, according to them. Not just health and the food chain. It has to do with the ecology. And they're suggesting we fight Monsanto. Join the GMO Awareness Month in October. That's coming up. And this is put out by a group called Climate Connections. Wow, this is getting a little bit more intricate. And perhaps it's for this reason we should be concerned. Take a look at what happens. It's not just what happens in California, because there are other things nationally. Why should we be concerned about California? Well, because there are a lot of Walmarts in California, and Walmart has just decided to do what? Well, to carry GMO corn.
Well, as we near the end of summer, shoppers continue to hit the supermarket for those final summer barbecues. But do most people know what they're really buying at the grocery store? Retail giant Walmart has recently confirmed that it will soon start selling Monsanto's new sweet corn. But what's troubling is that this corn has been genetically engineered with an insecticide built right into its DNA. This particular toxin found inside your corn occurs naturally inside caterpillars and even some moths. The toxin is a powerful insecticide that's proven to liquefy the stomach linings of insects that try to grab a bite. So we know what it does to bugs, but at this point, we don't know what it can do to humans. So what does this all mean for the corn consumer? To discuss this and more, I was joined by Ken Albala, history professor at University of the Pacific and author of the book you see there, The Lost Arts of Hearth and Home. He first explained how grocery stores can sell genetically modified corn with insecticides, that have never been tested on humans.
Well, that's true of all genetically modified food, but we've been eating it for quite a long time anyway. I mean, the genetically modified field corn has been on the market for a long time. It just gets made into corn syrup and corn oil and other products. So it's not like this is brand new to us. We've been eating it for a long time. And even the Bacillus thuringiensis has been used on plants in the US for about 50 years and in general for about a century. So that's also really nothing new at all. And in fact, the strange irony is BT is organic. So I think, I mean, we know in general that that's fairly safe. What we don't know is what happens when you genetically modify it to have the corn express the bacteria itself.
I guess you say it's organic because it comes from insects, from bugs. But what is significant about all this is that now it's being sold at Walmart, a grocery store that sells a quarter of the grocery foods in this country. So,
wow, that's explosive right there. Walmart now sells 25%, a quarter of all the food in this country, and it's deciding to sell GMO corn, and you don't even know it. We haven't been told, it's not labeled. This is why the California fight's very
Ken, this is
important.
really affecting a lot of people.
It is, and I think it would be nice to label it. I think Walmart knows very well if they put a label on it, people would just shudder in fear and run, and maybe that's not a bad thing. I think, you know, the pending legislation in California, hopefully something will, some labeling laws will be put in place, and maybe the rest of the country will follow suit.
Well, that's the question. Will the rest of the country follow suit? Will the people of California who put this petition forward be successful? It's not clear they will. $27 million have been raised against them. They've got $2 million in their own fight to try to make the case. Well, this is what we're up against. Where can you turn to information on this kind of thing? You can go to foodmatters.tv and to the Farm and Fork link in the left-hand corner to get information on this. It'll be continued to be posted, but we have to look to this as a problem in the full cost accounting of petro-dependent agriculture. Keep in touch with us on air and online from time to time, where we will discuss these different aspects of full cost accounting of petro-dependent agriculture. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.